ろしくお願いします。まずは今日、This is the English version. So, and I realized my title is still in Japanese. So, outgoing HR management and being proactive human resources departments. I was standing here a few days ago doing the Japanese version. I'm happy that you have chosen to come here today to listen to my English version. My content is mostly the same, but I think that speaking Japanese versus speaking English, maybe I'll say things differently. If I say something different, because it's from an English perspective, I'll also explain to you. But everybody here, if I speak in this speed, just shake your head if you understand what I'm saying. Yes, no problem. Okay. Okay. 日本語になったら問題ある? Okay, all right. So, as I'm going to talk about today, we need to be flexible. So, in Japan, even sometimes we'll speak Japanese, sometimes we speak English. Today is English Day. よろしくお願いします. So, my question to you all is this. Are you practicing what I'm going to refer to as outgoing HR? Outgoing. What I mean by HR that is outgoing that kind of puts things into action. Okay. In Japanese, we might say, go to the genba, right? Is your HR the HR of putting things into action? Now, to be outgoing, you need to overcome what everyone is saying. And let me suggest, I am speaking firstly to an audience that is working primarily for a Japanese company. So some of you might be working at Gaishike. Some of you might be working at a Japanese company. I work a lot with Japanese companies. So this is what I'm hearing from everybody. My company is very domestic. Do you hear that all the time? Marugome desu. Very domestic. Okay. We're not really a global company, but you have subsidiaries all around the world. You have sales that might be almost 50% of total revenue coming from overseas, and I still hear HR people saying, we're not a global company. I don't speak English very well. Now, again, this is a group where I'm speaking English to you. Maybe you don't say that. But how many times are people using English as an iwake, an excuse for not doing work that includes people and issues that are of a global nature? And lastly, people say, I'm not really a global worker. I'm not the global person. So this kuchiguse, we need to overcome to be what I'm going to call outgoing HR. This is what people are saying all the time here in Japan. So I want to suggest to be a global HR person is not to go out there, but to have the will to connect with people from all over the world, wherever you are right now. This is the theme of what I want to talk to you about today. A small group, but I like small groups because hopefully we can interact. I'm looking at your faces already. You're smiling. I'm smiling back at you. So let's try to talk together. Okay. So first, my self-introduction. Who am I? So last year, I was standing in this room, and I started talking about what I believe are 4 elements that all globalizing companies need to be aware of. But specifically, these are 4 elements that are very important for Japanese companies to be aware of. And I don't believe most people working in HR are thinking in these terms. So let me explain. Okay. I call that then the four gaps that are hindering, holding back global synergy. Okay. What are these four gaps? The four gaps that hinder global synergy. Firstly, we do have, which is obvious, cultural gaps, cultural differences. There's different way of doing business in each country, different history, different background. We know this. But I would like to suggest to you that this gap is not the biggest gap. This is not the biggest problem Japanese companies have. It's the problem that everybody talks about. Oh, understanding foreigners is difficult. We have different culture. What do we need to do? We need to learn about culture. No, yes, it's important, but it's not the entire story. What's more important is what I want to put here. Information gaps. I am dealing with this every day that I'm talking with any Japanese company about business issues. Simply said, information gaps are a real difficulty for Japanese company competitiveness. Let me explain. If you are a Western company and the language being spoken is English, it's very easy to take any document that was written in English and immediately send it by email to all the overseas subsidiaries and expect that everybody can understand the information. What about in Japan? Most of the time, the information is written firstly in Japanese. Sometimes that information is translated, but translation is a long process. Sometimes that information is shared. So what is happening is that there is this major gap in information. Before we can even be a globally synergized company, we first need to focus on how to minimize these information gaps. So I raise this to you to say, are you aware of this? Are you aware, if you're in Japan at a headquarters, that you know things about the company that your overseas colleagues have not been able to understand because they have not always received the information? Are you bridging that? Are you making efforts to share information? This is the gap that exists. Okay? Now, from the overseas perspective sometimes thinks Japan is hiding information from us. Japan is not wanting to be open with us. But sometimes the problem is just simply nobody thought to translate that memo into English, German, French. This is a big problem. So this is the first gap, second gap, which I see happening more and more. Now the third gap is what I'll call organizational gaps. What's an organizational gap? An organizational gap is the very fact that in a global company, we have very different perspectives. We have the HQ, the headquarter perspective. Hopefully the headquarter perspective is seeing the entire world's business. But sometimes we're very domestic. So headquarters is only focusing on Japan. Okay, that's a problem. But hopefully the headquarters is looking at the global business. But if you're working at an overseas subsidiary, what do you know? Sometimes you only know what's right in front of you in your subsidiary. So we have different perspectives on the business. The different perspectives give us a different understanding of urgency. What are the real issues? This is happening naturally most of the time. But how well is HR aware of this and trying to minimize these gaps? That's the question that I want to ask to HR people today. And then the fourth gap is what I'll call the personal differences gap. What is this gap? Simply said, it's this. As a non-Japanese person living in Japan, it is very clear every day that my face shows that I did not originally, I wasn't born here, could have grown up here. I met an Indian gentleman the other day. I said, "Where are you from?" His answer, "Kawasaki." Why? He was born in Japan. But his entire life, he has an Indian face. Okay? So, alright, that's also a side point. The point being, it's very easy for a group of Japanese people to say, "We Japanese, wareware Nihonjin." And to then take that perspective and compare it to Gaijin. Nihonjin, Gaijin. And you create these two distinctions. If we are HR people, we must be better than that. We must realize that there are similarities amongst Japanese people. But we also need to look at each person individually and figure out how to really understand the people individually so that we are not relying upon such stereotypes. Is HR doing this well enough? My answer to you, from what I observe, not well enough yet. These are the four gaps that are existing in a lot of Japanese companies. Now, they exist in other globalizing companies. I just am more interested in Japan. So I explain it all in terms of a Japanese perspective. Okay? This is what I talked about last year. Okay? But I have been writing an article for the past year about this and really thinking about what we can be doing on a very practical basis, right? Now, of course, for culture, we need to try to integrate culture. What is that global culture? What is that global way? And how can we ensure that everybody understands that spirit? Okay. Information gaps. How can we as HR people try to look at the overall organization and see where the real gaps are and how we can influence the fair exchange of information? Organization gaps. How can we encourage collaboration as HR people? And lastly, for personal differences, the personal gaps, how do we get beyond our stereotypes? This is the imperative for HR. Does this make sense? Do you have any kyokan about this? Does it make sense to you? Do you feel these problems in your organizations? Okay. So let me assume you understand what I'm saying. And now move on to what I really want to talk about today, which is, what do we need to do as HR people? I created documentation, one slide deck in English and Japanese. I realize this slide is more Japanese than English. But basically what I'm trying to say here is these issues are affecting all Japanese companies. But in my experience each day, I see some companies that are making efforts to really overcome these gaps. Okay? Where some companies are still just not aware of the problems. And what makes the difference? What makes the difference is not the industry. We could say some industries are more globalized than other industries. That makes sense. But that's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is that the efforts to minimize such gaps are based upon who is in HR, the people in HR, and the mindset, action, and skill set that they have. So really what I want to talk to you about today is what I believe is the mindset, action, and skills for globalizing HR department And I call that outgoing HR. So the first point. The first point I want to say to you is global is in within me. This is the mindset of an outgoing HR person. Let me explain. So, I am aware, I know it's a small group, I'm very aware that how long have you been in Japan now? 10 months. Okay. Alright. So then you're understanding kind of the context. Okay. And for those of you, and let me just, who's working in HR at a Japanese company? Just raise your hand. Nobody? In HR at Japanese company. One person. Only one. Okay. Sherman, Japanese. Online. Okay. Online. Okay. Okay. Alright, so then talking to people in the context of Japan, one thing that I hear all the time, I did a Google Kensaku in Japanese for the usage of the word global. Global de katsuyaku. Global ni katsuyaku. Actually, global ni katsuyaku is, if you do a Google Kensaku, there's a lot of different elements about global ni katsuyaku. Or global no butai de katsuyaku to do global work. Now, of course, there's a difference between being on Japanese soil and working any place else in the world. There's a big difference. But what I want to suggest as HR people, what we first need to realize is that global is not a place. Global is not a place. So in the general discussion in Japanese, there's this kind of sense that here, Japan, this is not global. This is domestic. But anything outside of Japan is global. That's my understanding of the general discourse discussion. I think it's nonsense. Because global is not just about a place. So here's the logic. Where is Japan? Japan is in a country on the earth. The earth is a globe, right? To say that we are not global basically is trying to say that we don't live on the same earth as everybody else. Okay? But we do. So I want to suggest this, and for me, global is here right now. For you too. Global starts right here in Tokyo. It comes from within you, right? So, global starts here. So all of this discussion about global jinzai ikse, okay, as if global jinzai are different, a completely different animal than Nihon kokunai jinzai, is too simple of a discourse. You first, before you can become global, you need to be good here in Japan, right? And how can you be good here in Japan as a worker? You first need to develop yourself as a worker here and start developing a mindset. A mindset that there's fluidity. What works in Japan could work overseas. What works in Japan sometimes needs to be changed for overseas. And it's understanding that it's not as simple as just saying domestic versus global. And if you're HR people, you must change that discussion. You have to make the discussion more sophisticated. What really is different about Japan than any place else? What is the same? How can Japanese practices and ideas become business standards for overseas subsidiaries or provide value for overseas markets? I think all of this is possible, but I sometimes find that the HR people are limiting themselves to a group we'll call the domestic group, where just a few people are more involved in the global work. Companies that are developing are companies where the work and the assignments are simultaneously, at the same time global and at the same time domestic. At the same time focusing on what's happening right here in Japan and thinking about what's out there. Global is not a place, it starts within you, your perspective, your interest. This is the mindset of an outgoing HR person in this globalizing era. Second mindset point. I don't rely upon assumptions and stereotypes. This is what we must say. This is what we must think when we are an outgoing, globalizing HR person. Okay. This is hopefully an obvious point, but it's not obviously followed in the daily work of many people. So, I hear things all the time. I get a lot of questions. Foreigners are not loyal to the company and will quit, right? Foreigners only do what is written in their job description. This is sometimes said. The Japanese HR system of employment is unique. Is this really true? Okay, welcome. So, the reason I write this here, you might say, but Bryan, isn't this simplistic? But I read articles written in Japanese for a Japanese audience, and I see these statements that simply try to sort of take the Japanese structure, compare it to everything overseas, and make generalizations. As globalizing HR people, I'd like to suggest that we need to question one. Foreigners are not loyal to the company and will quit? Really? Maybe. Sometimes. But are Japanese quitting sometimes? And is there such thing as tenshoku in Japan? Yes. Okay. But are there foreigners that have worked at Japanese companies for 20 years? Yes, I've met them. So this is a stereotype. Foreigners only do what's written in their job description. Okay, what's the stereotype of this? The stereotype is that the Japanese HR structure is based upon fluid assignments, and that overseas HR is all based upon job descriptions. Let me give you some insight. That's not true. Anybody that is saying to you that it's always true that there's a job description is only looking at half of the truth. The job description might exist as a document. It might exist as a contract, as part of employment in France. I've seen that. It's very detailed. But there's also a clause in a job description that says, and you will do whatever else your boss asks you to do. Okay? So, actually, the expectation is not that different than the expectation given to Japanese workers. Teamwork. Work together. Okay? This is not a full truth. Anybody that is writing that in Japanese or telling you that this is true is relying upon an assumption and stereotype, generalization. Okay? And last point, the Japanese HR system of employment is unique. Is this true? Maybe. Maybe not. We need to have a deeper conversation about this. Right? So, the point being for this short seminar, the mindset of outgoing HR is to question anytime somebody makes a generalization or statement. Question, is this true all the time? Some of the time? And when other people in business are making decisions based upon these stereotypes, please speak out. This is the mindset. Third point. Something I call I have a clear stance. And this is something which I'm trying to explain clearly in English and Japanese. And firstly, if you look at the word stance, in Japanese. I wrote it in katakana. Just tell me, help me. What does this mean to you? Can somebody explain stance in English? Now this is training. You thought you were here just for a one-way seminar, but I want to engage you. Stance. What does that word mean to you? Anything? Any meaning? Stance. No? Yeah. Anybody? Please speak up, please. Okay. All right. So that's not help. Okay. Opinion. Okay. Opinion. So something like an opinion. Opinion. Commitments. What I want to say here, when we are doing global work, and again, I'm speaking mostly because I'm working with people from the headquarters. I hear headquarter people saying, we want to do global governance. We want to create global HR. Great. But what should be our stance? That is where a lot of people are getting lost. So what I mean by that is having a stance means that you're able to think about and explain your own perspective and the perspective of the headquarters so that overseas group company colleagues can understand and respect the vision and direction. Okay, simple point. But again, this is where I'm seeing a lot of companies get stuck. Some companies are doing this well. Some companies are still stuck. Why? Why are they not? Why are they stuck? Because they haven't yet figured out what is the core for their HR policy. What is the core for their practices that they want all the overseas subsidiaries to understand and follow. But similarly, they have not always figured out what are areas that we can collaboratively work together on. Maybe the headquarters doesn't have all the answers. So where can the headquarters work collaboratively to get new ideas from the overseas people as well? And sometimes, where can the headquarters say, that's not an issue for us to make a decision about, we leave it to your judgment? 3 levels. These are 3 levels. 3 levels where sometimes the headquarters should be strong. This is my stance. This is what we believe to be right. We're coming from Japan, but this isn't just a Japanese way of thinking. This is the global vision. Be clear with that. But then sometimes say, I'm not sure what our final decision is. Let's make up this decision together. And then sometimes say, that's a local issue. We're not going to be involved in that. Making sure that each person in the HR department is able to speak from this kind of stance is what I'm referring to. And I know for a fact, because I've worked in the HR department, within the headquarters, there's not always enough time spent categorizing issues in this way. So that what happens is that people get lost. Here's an example. You can't read this, I don't think, because it's too small, but let me just take some pink points out. This is from an article that I've been writing. It's on my website, if you'd like to see it. And I must say, it's from Jinji Jitsu magazine. But I've worked with one Japanese company, and they said, you know, we have gone overseas to the overseas subsidiaries. Great, because there are issues, and we want to work with the overseas people on trying to understand what's the core of these issues. Great, but the overseas colleagues, they're not very cooperative. They're not cooperating with us. Okay? Well, but we want to support them. We want to support them. Okay. Okay. But what do you really want to do together? Well, we want to support them. Okay. So what I'm getting at is this. In Japanese, or in English, the word support is very unclear. Okay. You're laughing. Okay. In English, we say it's called euphemistic language. Euphemism, or kind of very soft language, which is unclear. See, even in English, too, where it's sometimes ambiguous. But to say, I want to support you, from an overseas standpoint, maybe that means you're trying to control us, right? So you're using the word support to mean control. Or maybe you really are saying that you want to kind of be below us and let us be in control, but you're just here to give a little bit of help when necessary. Okay. So what I'm saying is there are different roles that we need to play as HQ people. Okay. Or if you're in the overseas position, there are some times when you want the headquarters to be strong and to give you a clear direction. Sometimes when you want the headquarters to give you more flexibility. So we must add into our language, when we speak Japanese or English, or Chinese or French, whatever languages we're speaking, clarity about the perspective from which we're speaking. And what I mean by that is our stance. In this global organization, we need to figure out what the roles are between each of us and operate from those different roles. The mindset of having a clear stance is what's necessary to effectively manage communication and collaboration. So I gave to you already, just if you're following, there were 3 mindsets. The mindset of global is within me. The second mindset of not relying upon stereotypes or assumptions. And the third mindset of having a clear stance. Now, I'll give you 2 actions. Now, of course, if we're thinking about the competencies that are necessary for HR people, wherever you could find a lot of different lists. But what I'm trying to do today is present to you what I believe are some of the core elements for globalizing Japanese companies that are trying to minimize these gaps. Okay? Just to give you context again as to what I'm talking about. So the next is this idea. I act inclusively and collaboratively. It starts from HR. So sometimes HR people, it's a difficult job. We work hard and we're busy every day. And then if you do an employee survey, it turns out that a lot of the employees say, well, HR doesn't listen, HR doesn't care, HR is not involved. So the mindset, or sort of the action of HR should be to be as inclusive and collaborative as possible. And why am I saying this for HR? The logic. Globalization, this era that we're in, everything we're talking about is about being global. It requires that we have new synergies across the company, sometimes just within the same country, across the different departments, but many times across the borders, across the group companies. And so, to make this happen, it really comes down to the mindset and the way that the individual people act. So, inclusive and collaborative, starting from HR. inclusive meaning HR people need to seek out the ideas and opinions of other departments and other overseas subsidiaries, and endeavor to create opportunities for all people to contribute to the company, regardless of national origin or original place of hire. So, if this is not within the mindset of HR, the company will never be able to overcome these gaps. So global talent management initiatives are a good example of such a case study. So there's two examples that I can give to you, the good and the bad. I have two memories. This is the bad. Going into talk with an HR department about, and they're in earnest. This HR department they're very interested in creating more of a global company. And I said to one of the HR managers, he said, I want to create more global HR governance. I said, great. Okay, just tell me a little bit. When was the last time that you spoke with the overseas HR people? We don't do that. Why not? Well, we have expatriates. So we send the expatriates from Japan. They give us the information. There's no need to talk with the local people. I'm not working with that company. So that's kind of one example of the company not being very inclusive. Okay? That happened just 2 years ago. It still stays with me. Okay? Another example, talking to a company about trying to create a global development program, the need to bring overseas people to Japan to help them understand more about the company, to give them opportunities to really grow. And the answer he gave to me was, well, but we haven't done that enough for ourselves yet. He says this in Japanese, but what he meant was, we haven't done enough in Japan, so focusing on the overseas subsidiaries is too early. Okay. And I've seen that kind of way of thinking with some companies. Okay. Which is to say, it's that dichotomy, that division of Japan first, overseas subsidiaries second. Okay. I'm critical of it right now in this seminar. But it's something that I understand. I understand why people operate from that, because they focus on what's easiest or what's in front of them. But to be a truly outgoing HR person, we must be doing what other companies are doing well. And what are some companies doing well? They're saying, currently we have how many Japanese people that have been sent overseas in top management positions. We will continue to send Japanese people as long as they're necessary and that they serve the best purpose. But if there's somebody local, we'll hire that person into the position just as well. And we're going to create the structures for doing this so that we can provide people with more opportunities for contributing to the company over the long term. Within the same country of Japan, I see both of these. That's what's fun about doing what I do right now. Because I cannot make one broad generalization about Japan. Because there's so many different perspectives, even within Japan, even within Tokyo. All of these are stories of Tokyo, right? And the difference comes back to the acting and actually thinking about being inclusive and collaborative. The realization that if you just have a discussion in Japan alone, you might have a good discussion, but if you can open that discussion up to others, you might get more feedback, more ideas. But then likewise, if you open the discussion to others, you must have a clear stance. Because if you open everything to everybody, then it takes too much time. So how do you manage these relations? This is the imperative of good HR. And moving forward, what else is necessary? So, number one was acting inclusively and collaboratively. I give that to you, I say that acting inclusively and collaboratively is how HR itself needs to act. But that alone is not good enough. The next step is for HR to act in a more facilitative way. So what do I mean by this? HR does not exist for the HR department. HR exists to work for, to serve, to sometimes lead the other departments. I believe that that's what HR, the potential of HR. HR is not simply there to respond to the other departments, but is actually there to sometimes be a facilitator, a bridge. HR should not be hesitant to get involved in the business issues of other departments in order to facilitate inclusion and collaboration throughout the company. So the question, if you are HR people, is how often are you personally getting involved in some of the issues that are holding back other departments from having good collaboration, communication? So if HR firstly takes care of itself, and you learn how to create global collaboration, that then becomes the internal know-how that can be brought to other departments. And HR can be a facilitator. Here's a case study of that. In April, 2 months ago, I was the facilitator for a company that was doing a global diversity and inclusion meeting. So what is that? So the HR department in that company has been spending a lot of time creating global HR structures, policies, working with their overseas HR colleagues. So that's the idea of being inclusive and collaborative firstly. But this idea of the global diversity and inclusion meeting, it was a meeting that involved salespeople. So not non-HR people from the overseas subsidiaries, from Japan. HR people from Japan, HR people from overseas. So it was cross-functional discussion meeting about how to increase diversity and inclusion within the entire company. HR-led initiative. So this is an example of how HR can step up to be facilitated. Now sometimes the HR people do it themselves, sometimes they bring in outside facilitators, but this is the potential of how HR can impact the company and be outgoing. And going back to my logic of those 4 gaps exist, but if the HR people are not acting in a facilitative way, you will never be able to minimize those information gaps and organizational gaps within the company. Last point, communication skills. This is the one. This one is written on any kind of listing of competencies of HR people, right? But in the context of Japan, what do I want to say? And this is where, the other day when I speak in Japanese, I'm speaking in Japanese to a group who might not speak English, or want to speak English. Today, you're all here for the English version. So, maybe you understand these points. But how do we help other people? This is the perspective I want to speak from. And what I mean is, language, communication, needs to be more flexible, more fluid. There are moments when Japanese will be the best language. There are moments when English will be the best language to speak. There are moments when another language is best and we just need a translator. Right? case study. English is the official language of the company. Just a little background, as you know, right? Here in Japan, in the past few years, a few companies have made a lot of news by saying the koyogo, the official language, is English. Is that a good idea? Here's my answer. No. Did you think I was going to say that's a great idea? But here's the problem. It goes back to the idea of being flexible. It goes back to the idea of doing what's right for the situation. This concept of creating English as the official language, if it goes as far as saying that Japanese people must speak English together, that's not, maybe sometimes. If there's somebody in the room who doesn't speak Japanese, then yes. But otherwise, speak Japanese. Right? This fluidity. But once again, coming back to the beginning of today's thought, what I'm seeing in Japan is a lot of globalization efforts. I see a big distinction between companies that are making efforts to be global, collaborative, inclusive, and others that are still creating a division line between everything Japanese and everything outside. And language is the reason for this just as well. The belief that Japanese is what we speak here domestically. And that all the foreigners, they speak English, they speak something else. And you create a division line. But my point is, we shouldn't have just one official language. We should have as many official languages as we need to be communicative and do our business well. Right? But practically, what does that mean? Well, it means appropriate communication for the situation. It means probably documents that are one side Japanese, one side English, maybe. It might mean imperfect English, but good enough to just send out to people and to communicate an idea. Right? The fear of making mistakes should not be part of the daily work. We just need to do what we need to do. In other words, this requires a certain courage, which still, even for HR people, I think is something we need to build. So if we can build this idea of flexible communication. And by the way, that also means sometimes that Japanese people need to teach English to the overseas people. Let me say that again. Japanese people need to teach English to overseas people. What I mean by that is Japanese people need to communicate with overseas people the level of language that is comfortable and clear for good communication. I do training very often, and this is a major point of my training. Do not, when you don't understand, speak up. When you need somebody to change their way of talking, help explain what you understand, what you don't understand. This requires a courage which I know most people are not stepping up and having. So it's resulting in lots of miscommunication. So the next time a foreigner starts speaking really fast like this, whoa, too fast, hold on, please slow down. Use a different word. That courage is what's necessary for good communication. So I give these to you today as the mindset, the actions, and the skills for good outgoing HR. In order to overcome these gaps which are existing in all companies. And some of these gaps won't exist as long as we have people working in a company. But how does HR try to minimize these gaps? After thinking about this issue for the past year, I suggest that these are some very, very important mindsets, actions, and skills of outgoing HR. So I give it to you today for your consideration. So are you practicing outgoing HR? Are there any things that I said today that's, yeah, we say that. Maybe we should stop thinking that way, or we should do something a little bit different. I hope there's been a hint or two from this discussion. But lastly, allow me to just tell you what's in your packet, because